Hi and welcome to the workshop. Today I'm looking at traditional bookcases and more specifically the joints you can use when you're building your own. So I've got the side of a bookcase here. This is a sample, obviously. Side of a bookcase, we're going to have a overlapped top on there, and we're going to have a middle shelf that will be fixed so that it holds the two sides together so that they don't bow out. And then we're going to be able to put additional fixed shelves in between. And obviously if you want to put moving shelves or movable shelves, I would suggest putting rows of shelf holes inside the carcass, and then you can just use shelf pins and put your shelves in wherever you like. But obviously if you've got a tall bookcase, you've got to be able to pull the sides in together. So you need a fixed shelf in there somewhere, and it needs to stop the sides pulling away, so those joints can't open out. So we're going to be using 3 different types of housing joints. We're going to be using a dovetailed housing joint which has just the slope side on one side, a dovetail housing joint which is going to be for the middle shelf, which has a slope side on both faces, and that's really going to hold those two sides together. And then we can use just a normal housing joint for putting the fixed shelves in. Slightly differently though, because of the lengths that we've got of material here, and a bookcase might have up to say about a foot in depth. To get that housing all together, dovetail housing, you're going to have to push it in from the front here all the way to the back. That's going to be quite tight, and if you've got glue on it as well, you're really going to struggle. Exactly the same with the shelves. You'd imagine putting a shelf in from the back where we've got the opening for it, sliding that dovetail all that way in there with glue on it, very difficult. With a normal housing joint, not quite so bad because you can insert it straight from the side. So where we're using the dovetailed housings, we're going to be making them tapered, and I'll demonstrate that and explain that as we go through it. So this first one, I'm going to show you the joint for putting the top on the case, which is going to be a dovetail or half dovetail housing, and it's going to be tapered. So the first joint is going to be the one I'm using for the top of the bookcase, where I'm joining the top onto the top of the side. It's going to have the groove for that in the top, and that's going to be open at the back of the top, and it's going to be stopped at the front. Reason is we don't want to see the joint from the front, and we're going to insert the side from the back of the top like so, and then that will stop with an overhang at the front. That means the actual dovetailed end is going to be on the top of the side of the case. So we'll need to put a guide mark all the way around the outside, which will give us the depth that we're going to. Then we'll also gauge the depth on the back of the top, and we need to gauge the sides in on the top. Anyway, let's go through that step by step. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my marking gauge. I'm going to set that to approximately 1/3 of the thickness of the top. That's going to be how deep the housing is and how low the shoulder is on the top of the sides. So I can then scribe that round on the sides. And I've got bull-nosed pieces that I'm working with here, so it makes it a little bit more awkward. Then what I'm going to do on the underside of what's going to be the top, and remember this is being constructed like this, so if we flip it upside down, we can set off the overlap we want. We can set up the overlap we want here at the front of the bookcase and the overlap on the sides. And we can pencil that in for now. From those marks we need to set in for the housing. Now, as I say, it's going to be tapered, so it's going to be narrower on the front so that when the pieces come together they tighten up, and it means it's easy to get the piece in from the back. In fact, far enough back we'll be able to drop it in like a normal housing and then slide it along so it tightens up. So let me square those lines back to the end of the board. I'll use a pencil gauge for that. Still slightly awkward because of the bull-nosed edging. Now, the position where I want this side of the case to go into the top, I've just transferred that down, squared it down at the back side, and now I'm going to scribe with the same marking gauge setting to give me the depth that housing needs to be. Now we need to get the dovetail shape in there, so I've got a dovetail marker here. Now for the straight edge, I can gauge from the side of the top all the way down to give me the edge of the housing. That's perfectly simple, that's the same as any other housing really. But on this other side we want to taper it. So our dovetail is starting here and emerges on the underside of the bookcase top. That's the widest part, and we need to taper that down to the front. So I'll take a rule, measure how wide we are down there. Okay, that's 14 mil. And down at this end, we need to reduce it a little bit. And let's bring it down to about 11 and a half. Again, not critical. As long as it's tapering, it'll make it a lot easier to put the parts together. Now what we need to do is run a line from that point to the back. We'll do that with a marking knife. And we've got our tapered housing. We need to then have a stop here because we don't want it to show through at the front. I'm going to stop about 1/2 inch from the end. So I'll just gauge that in with a pencil. That'll be our stop point. And now we need to saw those two sides. Sawing to a stop is going to be quite difficult. You can imagine the saw is going to want to come out. We will never be able to saw right the way down like that. So the easiest thing is to chop out a little section there so that we can then run the saw backwards and forwards into that section. So I'll get this clamped down on the bench. I'll chop out a little section just as though I was doing a mortise and then get back to you. So you can see I've chopped out an area here which will allow my saw to go through when I'm sawing the sides of the housing. Of course this side is vertical, so that recess I've made is perfectly okay. I can saw that one side. But this other side, I'm supposed to be sawing the dovetail into it. So actually what I'm going to need to do is relieve underneath this edge here, and I'll use the dovetail gauge I used to mark for the housing to guide the chisel in at the right angle like so, so that I relieve enough material. So having undercut that now, we're ready to do sawing. And I should point out, I've made this recess exactly the same depth as the depth that housing should be, and it is marked at the back here. So that's the same depth. So if I'm sawing, as soon as my teeth are cutting inside this mortise, and as soon as they get down to the baseline I've marked on the back here, then I know I've cut deep enough. Now, because this outside edge is going to be the straight housing, and the side of the bookcase is going to come right up to this line, I want to make that as clean as possible. So what I'm just going to do before I start to saw is just to use a chisel and make a little knife wall along there, so that I start my saw cut a little bit below the surface. So the straight side is sawn vertically. When it comes to the dovetail side, a little bit trickier, but if you need a bit of a gauge, use the dovetail marker again, just to line your saw up, like so. I've helpfully come right through a knot, which is great. So the saw cut's in. Now it's just a case of chiseling out the waste material. I'm going to be using a router plane to do most of that as well, and to get a nice flat bottom in the groove. Just angle the router plane to get underneath the dovetail section. Pretty much there you have it. You can clean up the side of the dovetailed section by clamping on a batten that's been shaped for the same profile as the dovetail itself. So this is sloping back, and I can reference my chisel off there and just pare down cleaning the edge of that cut. Now, because the side of the shelf wants to come forward of the housing that we've made here, we need to notch out the very front. So let's just mark across from where the end of the notch is, where the end of the housing is, and we'll notch out that little area there. By lining up the side with the top, you can mark off how wide the dovetail needs to be on this one side directly from there. For the other end, the front end, we have to do a bit of a measurement. So I measure the gap at the front, which was about 12. And I can mark across here that distance. Then I need to use the dovetail gauge to extend that over. So I'll mark that in. So this one mark shows us how wide it's going to be in the bottom of the socket, and this narrow one shows us how narrow it's going to be where it actually comes out of the top panel. So we've got that one worked out. We can then transfer that line all the way down to the other end of the side. So you can see the neck and then the sloped side of the tail. Now I'm just putting in a knife line to cut the shoulder in for the dovetail. What you can do, if you want, is use the chisel and just pare in the whole of that side. So most of my effort now is at the back of the saw, which is the heavily tapered end, or the narrower end of the dovetail housing. And I'll just bring that down to the neck of the tail. You can use the same setup we had before. That could be clamped on, or else you can just get the angle from there, hold the chisel at the right angle and just pare. And just pare into your saw cut. And you've obviously got a pencil line on this side which shows you how far down you need to come. Once you've taken most of it away, you can pare along the side, get it nice and straight, because obviously the tape is supposed to be straight, so this should be straight as well. So I'm not there yet, but this just gives you an idea how easily that slots in the end and how easily it starts to move along. It gets tighter as the taper starts to take. Now obviously I've got a bit more work to do, but I can just adjust that until the point where I can push it all the way up to the stop. I'm not going to glue it together because I want to do the other joints whilst the pieces are apart. But what I would do is just put glue just along the edges of the housing. Doesn't need a great deal. And then you put the two pieces together like so. Slide them up. I should slide most of the way with hand pressure, and then for the last little bit up to the stop. It's just going to need a little bit of hammering. So that's how I would attach the top on a simple bookcase. Very secure. Takes a bit longer than dowels, but it's certainly a lot better than the dowels. And it will last a lifetime. Next time I'll show you how I do the middle shelf and the intermediate shelves. Cheerio.